Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. This is the NARC staff. We're going to give folks maybe another minute or two to join in, and then we'll get started. Thanks. Hi everybody, good afternoon and thanks for joining us. My name is Maci Morin. I'm with NARC as a program coordinator, and I'd like to welcome you all to our 6th Summer Legislative Briefing, a series that we've started for our members to help provide you information on the biggest issues here in DC. So as you know, regions and localities have increasingly become motivated and willing partners with private businesses, with states, and with the federal government to help build a robust infrastructure for broadband that meets all the needs of residents. And this includes putting the proper plans in place to support the deployment of next generation wireless technologies, more well known as 5G. So while great efforts are being made by all parties to increase internet connectivity, local governments have recently found themselves fighting the assumption that they present barriers to broadband deployment rather than what we recognize as partnerships that can encourage effective regional broadband planning. And there are no timelier examples of this point than our 2 topics of discussion today, which is the Senate's recent introduction of the Streamlining the Rapid Evolution and Modernization of Leading-Edge Infrastructure Necessary to Enhance Small Cell Deployment Act, also known in a single breath as the STREAMLINE Act, and the recent activities at the Federal Communications Commission, also known as the FCC. So today, I'm happy to be joined by a wonderful colleague and a great friend to NARC, Angelina Panettieri, the Principal Associate of Technology and Communications over at the National League of Cities, also known as NLC. She will be reviewing the STREAMLINE Act for us, highlighting how the bill could preempt local authority over the deployment of small cell broadband technology, and how it could also create an unfunded mandate by instituting harsh timelines for the consideration and approval of requests by private corporations on these technologies. And she will also provide us a helpful look at what has been happening at the FCC, including the Commission's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, also known as the BDAC Committee, charged with writing state and local laws on broadband deployment. And her presentation will be followed by a short introduction to some advocacy tools you could use for the STREAMLINE Act, and also a Q&A session. So let me switch over to the agenda real quick. So if you would like to submit questions at any point during this presentation, feel free to type in a question at the right-hand side of your screen in the question box. You can also use the raise your hand function that will allow me to call on you and unmute your microphone during the Q&A session so you can ask questions to speakers directly. Or if you're having trouble with either one, you can just email me your question at my email below. It's maci.morin@narc.org. With that, I would like to more formally introduce our guest today. As I said, Angelina is the Principal Associate of Technology and Communications for NLC, and she manages telecommunications issues for the organization. Prior to serving in this role, she was NLC's Grassroots Advocacy Specialist and held lead responsibility for overseeing NLC's action-oriented grassroots efforts in support of its legislative agenda. And before joining NLC, Angelina was a government relations and public relations professional for the American Society of Consultant Pharmacists and the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's in public administration from George Mason University. With that, I will turn it over to Angelina.
Thank you so much, Maci, and thank you everybody for having me here today. I love this series that you're doing. It's such a cool opportunity, and I'm probably going to steal the idea from NARC for next summer. You guys have a great team here. So as Maci mentioned, it really seems like the sentiment in Washington is turning against local government. It seems like too many federal officials believe that cities are obstacles to progress rather than the laboratories of democracy that actually foster innovation and development in technology. And I think a really good, if unpleasant, example of this is at this month's public meeting of the FCC, where Commissioner Michael O'Reilly claimed that local officials were deliberately obstructing broadband infrastructure deployment as an ego boost and extracting so-called slush funds from wireless companies in an effort to prevent broadband from reaching their residents. And I think we all know that's not true. So I'm hoping that we can talk about what the threat is and how we can work together to combat it. So I'll start out by talking about Congress. As Maci mentioned, Congress recently introduced in the Senate S3157, the STREAMLINE Act. This bill was introduced by a bipartisan duo. It was Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii and Senator John Thune, South Dakota. And if passed as currently written, this bill would effectively transfer public property to private companies to conduct for-profit business by forcing local governments to offer their rights of way to wireless providers and tower companies for small cell facilities at cost. So that's instead of a market rate lease agreement or some other kind of negotiation with the provider. It would also create new, much shorter timelines for local governments to manage applications for small cell sites. And local governments that don't meet those new timelines would be subjected to a deemed granted provision. What that means is that the application would automatically be granted. And as you can probably guess, it seems like this would really just incentivize bad behavior on the part of providers and tower companies, because that really increases the incentive for them to dump large numbers of applications on local governments at once and hope that they can't get through it in time. It also limits what factors local governments can consider in the applications, and it would preempt any existing agreements that have already been negotiated with the provider's consent to incentivize development in particular locations, to promote digital inclusion, to offer in-kind contributions as part of the rate agreement. All of that would be stripped away. So NLC opposes this bill, as do all of the other state and local government groups, and we've already written letters with some of those groups in opposition. So the sponsors of the bill are well aware that state and local government do not support this effort. But we've also created a template letter that you can use on your own to send to your senators. And I believe Maci has a link to the online tool to use that for. You can either send it directly through that portal, or if you'd like, you can take the language and put it on your own letterhead and send it. I would just ask, if you do the latter, please send the NARC staff a copy of it so that we know who has been contacted and we can follow up with those offices if we need to. The House has not yet introduced a companion bill, but we do expect that probably Representative Marsha Blackburn will be the Republican co-sponsor. We don't know who the Democrat would be, but our guest would be a Democrat on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So if you're looking at who you need to pay attention to, if you have a representative on that committee, keep in touch with them. Let them know that you would not support this bill in the House either. We also expect that the Senate Commerce Committee will hold a hearing on this bill sometime in the fall, is what they've told us, so probably September, given the impending election. And we're working hard to make sure that there's a local government witness on that panel in that hearing. But ultimately, it's up to all of us together to educate our members of Congress on how small cell deployment actually works on the ground in communities, and how your communities are working with all of the different occupants of the right-of-way to make sure that public property is being shared fairly and used responsibly. The awareness level of people on both sides of the aisle in Congress is very low. The staff generally do not have a lot of education on the issue, and they're hearing a lot from the wireless industry on this, not so much from local governments. So it's really incumbent upon us to try and make up some of that difference. I think our winning strategy on this bill is ultimately to make it clear to members of the Senate Commerce Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee that this is not a non-controversial bill. This is a problematic bill. There are people who clearly oppose it, and that will make it harder for people to sign on to it and harder for it to be attached to something else that's moving. I know that lots of you have faced similar threats in your state capitals. So if you have had coalition partners or stakeholders you've worked with, maybe the utilities, maybe railroad companies, anybody else with a stake in the management of public rights-of-way, I would urge you to get in touch with them and work together with them on this issue. So now that I've sort of gotten everybody on a downer with Congress, I did also want to talk about some good things that are happening before I move over to the FCC. So we have had some victories this year, especially in the area of rural broadband. We've been trying to advocate for including broadband funding in any federal program where it makes sense. And we did have some victories with the authorization of a new rural broadband pilot program through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was included in this year's spending bill. So this pilot program is a one-time infusion of $600 million for rural broadband development, and communities with fewer than 20,000 residents will be eligible to participate. And the recipients of this funding could be anybody who's providing broadband to those communities, so private companies or rural electric co-ops or even local governments if they have or are planning to build a public broadband network. The USDA recently released a notice of inquiry about the pilot program looking for feedback before they officially open the application process. And they're looking for things specifically on how to evaluate whether households have sufficient access to broadband, whether they should be considering affordability, and also feedback on how to verify that the service speeds that are required through this program are actually being delivered. Comments on that are due on September 10th, and the NARC staff can provide you with more information about how to comment if you're interested in participating. And LC does plan to comment on that. So moving across town to the Federal Communications Commission, we are extremely busy. The Commission has a really ambitious agenda for this year, for the better or the worse, and it's going to impact local governments. So before I get into the BDAC, I did want to talk about a couple of rulemaking issues that are very time sensitive related to how we measure broadband access in America. So the first one is a request for comment that's due this Friday, August 17th. So if you don't have time to get in by that, I don't blame you. They didn't give us a lot of time to respond, and we are planning to raise that as an issue. But that's on the status of fixed broadband competition. This was required by the latest FCC reauthorization bill, and it requires the FCC to conduct a report on the current status of fixed broadband service competition, so fiber, cable, that kind of thing involving a wire, by the end of the year. This is a very short timeline, but NLC is working with a group of public interest groups to try and raise some of the specific issues that matter to local governments, like the value of municipal broadband in promoting competition, or even having broadband available at all in a lot of communities. We also want to urge the FCC to consider affordability as an issue as it's looking to the state of competition, as that's an important element of whether competition is even meaningful for people who live in a certain area. Finally, we want to make sure that the FCC understands that mobile broadband should not be considered as part of their analysis, because it isn't a true substitute for fixed broadband service. You may remember that there was a mayor's mobile-only challenge earlier this year where people spent a day only using their cell phone to conduct all of their daily life business. And that gets really difficult if you're looking at things like applying for a job or doing homework. It's just not a meaningful substitute for whole communities of people. We're concerned that some wireless providers may try to make the argument that it is a worthwhile substitute as part of their overall efforts to speed 5G deployment. So we just want to make sure that federal focus and investment in wireline broadband continues. On a related note, the FCC is also seeking feedback for its annual report on whether broadband is being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely fashion. And this report is important for two main reasons. It is when the FCC sets or reaffirms its speed definition for broadband service, and it's also when they determine the actual percentage of Americans who have broadband access. And those numbers are determined or are used to determine a lot of other things and a lot of other federal programs and policies. So comments on this proceeding are due September 10th, with reply comments due September 24th. There's a lot of debate this year around whether the FCC should increase its definition of broadband service to be a faster threshold. There's a lot of debate between members of the commission right now about whether the current definition is sufficient or possibly even too much, or whether it's not enough at all. But we'll probably be focusing on a lot of the same issues: the fact that municipal broadband is important, that competition and access are still not truly available, even when the infrastructure exists in a lot of places, people can't afford it, and just continuing to highlight those same issues. And then one other rulemaking issue before I move on to the BDAC. So this past month, in the same public meeting where Commissioner O'Reilly had those very colorful comments, the FCC approved a measure that included some real implications for regions and local governments. It includes a report and order and declaratory ruling that address both wireline and wireless broadband infrastructure. So the first part, which is the report and order, creates rules around one-touch make-ready activities for new entrants into the wireline internet service market. And if you aren't familiar with this term, what one-touch make-ready means is essentially that if a new wireline provider, so like a Google Fiber or some company like that, wanted to attach to poles that were already owned by a different provider, they used to have to wait for each different occupant on that pole to move their equipment separately. So if there was a phone company and a cable company and an electric company already on that pole, they had to wait for each of those entities to go up separately in a bucket truck and move their equipment up or down so that they could attach. But the new rules allow for a third-party contractor to move everybody's equipment at one time, rather than having to do it one at a time. So this does represent a victory for those cities that had already enacted one-touch make-ready ordinances that had been challenged in court. NLC didn't have any position on it actually, but for those cities, it is affirming their ability to do that. The other part of the FCC's action, the declaratory ruling, this is the concerning part. So the declaratory ruling included a blanket ban on local moratoria on wireless infrastructure siting. Providers have been complaining to the FCC about local moratoria, and the FCC says in this ruling that it interprets statute, its congressional authorization, to mean that all local moratoria for any reason are legal prohibitions on the provision of wireless service. So this means that even short-term moratoria, such as those that a local government might set up to give themselves time to pass an ordinance, or handle the aftermath of a storm, or deal with holiday-related street congestion, those would all be prohibited. I'm expecting to see cities and counties raising legal challenges to this ruling, and we'll be prepared to offer support to those challenges in amicus briefs. For the time being, if you're in a community that's looking at having moratoria, I would tread very carefully because you are much more likely to be challenged by providers on that. And then finally, the BDAC. So the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, or BDAC, continues to work on its recommendations for broadband infrastructure policy. If you have been reading the updates on telecom policy in the FCC, you may recall that this is a group that was formed by FCC Chairman Pai last year in early 2017 to advise the Commission on broadband deployment policy and to create model state and local codes for broadband deployment. Now, NLC has had problems with this group from the start because as soon as the membership was appointed, we observed that it was made mostly of industry representatives that dramatically outnumbered the state and local participants. In fact, currently, after tripling the number of local representatives on the BDAC, they are now only outnumbered 10 to 1, to give you an idea of what we're facing. We've also just objected to the characterization and the structure of the group in general because it assumes that local government is a barrier to broadband deployment that needs to be preempted. Also, while it wasn't an explicit charge for the group, it has focused often excessively on wireless issues, particularly small cell wireless deployment, without looking at things like rural challenges or consumer affordability. However, I think our local representatives on the BDAC have really punched above their weight, and they've made some major progress in minimizing the harms that were presented by industry representatives, especially in the drafting of these state and local model codes. The local model code was approved at the most recent meeting this summer, And it still has some problems. So NLC is working with the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors on an alternate model for people who want something to work with that wasn't written by industry. The state model code hit a serious bog in the last meeting. There was a bit of an impasse, so large portions of it have been tabled for future discussion, in part because there were no local representatives on the group that drafted it, and so it came to the larger body with a lot of problems. The other interesting thing about the BDAC, which is authorized to work through next March, is that Chairman Pai also announced the creation of a new working group within the BDAC. And this group is going to be focused on broadband infrastructure in the context of disaster preparedness, resiliency, and recovery. They're taking applications for this group until September 7th. That's not a lot of time, but it's not an onerous application process. It is going to be a lot of work for anyone who's interested, but we desperately need local emergency management experts to be involved in this. So if you know anybody who is qualified, who would be good at this, I strongly encourage you to reach out to them and apply. And if you know of local officials who are applying, please let us know so that we can endorse and support their applications. I think this is going to be a big deal, and it's going to be difficult because we're headed straight into hurricane season. We're already in wildfire season. A lot of the people with the most expertise on these issues have much more pressing matters ahead of them and much more local matters. But I think we've seen too many excuses of providers using hurricanes and floods as an excuse not to maintain their networks or to retire copper networks, let them degrade, and then not provide timely upgrades to reliable fiber service instead. So I think this is an important opportunity for us to advocate for those communities, and I hope that we can support everyone who applies and advocate for a much more balanced membership on this working group in the time that we have left. So with that, I've been talking a lot, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you. No, that was all really great information. I appreciate it, and I just want to state too that NARC definitely shares all the views that National League of Cities does, and we've been very lucky to be able to work on a few letters with them this year, including to Congress, and a few letters to the FCC, the most recent one being on the BDAC committee, and how we disagree with the composition of it, and how it is specifically geared towards overcoming barriers that they see as local governments and state governments, and the things that they have in place. So, and to her last point, for that working group, the BDAC committee is putting together on disaster preparedness and recovery, just echoing her thoughts and her sentiments there. Please let us know if you're interested in applying. I will definitely pass on more information, and we plan on sending out an email tomorrow to our entire membership on it, but we'd be happy to write up a letter of support for you, or for whoever, whatever local government official you may know that may be interested in being a part of this working group. We need a lot of really good people, and so far the BDAC committee has not been great about having local government representation, so any bit that we can get is extremely helpful and definitely appreciated. So with that, I just wanted to go over a few tools that I have put in the handouts, as well as the online submittal tool that Angelina referenced earlier. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you for a moment. All right. So the first one that I put up was the text of the bill for the STREAMLINE Act for you policy wonks out there who are interested in reading the language yourself and to getting a better sense of what the bill looks like in its entirety. But for those who want just a summary of this information, Angelina put together a really great one-pager highlighting the specific parts of the bill that cities are opposed to. And of course, we would say that regional councils of governments and MPOs would be against as well. So it's a great way to say if you're trying to put together a letter for your federal delegation, or you want to call them in opposition to this bill, we would recommend and encourage you to use some of these notes that Angelina so greatly laid out. And also we received a letter from Southwest Colorado Council of Governments. They recently reached out to their own federal delegation in opposition to this bill. So shout out to Miriam, who's on the call. Thank you for sharing this with us. I thought this would be a great opportunity for those on the call to see a letter that one of their peers sent, to see if they want to use it as a template of particular issues that were drawn out by another regional council of government that they could express to their own congressional representatives as well. And lastly, the online submittal tool by NLC. To get to this page, you can go to advocacy.nlc.org. And actually, since it's so timely, it is in this slider, so we don't have to even go anywhere fancy. Here, we'll press take action, and it actually allows you to enter in your zip code that you represent. So say, for example, I live in Maryland, so I'm going to put in 20785. Once I check the zip code, it provides me with a full-out letter all ready to go, and it also has check marks on the side of all of the representatives that represent the district that I live in and the state that I live in. And from here, you can structure this to represent your regional councils of government. You can have your cities, of course, use this verbatim pretty much, because it is written for city governments, but also counties that may be in your region as well may be interested in using this. So all you would have to do is just edit it to fit your needs, and then at the bottom here, you just have to fill out your information, and then just as easy as that, you can submit. But if you do use this, again, we would appreciate if you let us know, so we can let Angelina know, and of course, so we know ourselves if we need to follow up with these particular representatives to help you get the word across. And like I said, feel free to share it with your cities and your counties, because the more voices we get, the better. Okay, so with that, I think we covered everything. So sorry, that's pretty quick here. Are there any questions out there? Okay, I do see a hand raised. Let me see who that was. That was one. Oh, that was an accident. Sorry. Okay, no problem. I know that it's a lot of information and it's a lot to take in. I'm sure Angelina could share that sentiment too. So it may take a while to come up with any questions, but as you do, just know that Neil and I are here. I believe that our information is put up, but I'm going to put it up anyway. Our emails are available for you. Let us know if you have any questions. We're happy to hook you up with Angelina if you would be comfortable with doing that. She's a great resource, and I'm sure she would be happy to help.
Absolutely. We sit in the same building together with the counties and the regional councils, and we're all here together for a reason.
Exactly. That is right. Let me see. We may have another question here. Okay. We see. When do we expect the USDA to open grant applications for the rural broadband program?
That is a really good question. When I last went in to talk to them about it, they said that they were hoping to do that in the late fall timeframe, maybe November. At the time, they were hoping to get this notice of inquiry out a little sooner, so I don't know if that schedule has been pushed back any, but I know their goal was to start getting money out the door as early as January. So we will send out information as soon as that is available for applications, but I am expecting probably sometime in the next few months. Unfortunately, just don't have anything more exact than that. I think a lot of it depends on them getting approval from council and their departments.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I see that Michael Parks from Brazos Valley Council of Governments has a question, so I am going to unmute him. All right, Michael, are you there?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
Yeah, so I thought I heard in the presentation where this bill will supersede agreements that existing jurisdictions might have with providers. A couple of questions come to mind. One, is this just on the wireless side, or what about the wired side as well? And then if we have agreements that, you know, they've agreed to, we've agreed to, we have a working relationship, does it, if the STREAMLINE Act is passed, does it just null and void all of that?
So those are good questions, and it does specifically apply just to small cell deployments. One of the things, though, that we've brought up with the co-sponsors of the bill is that if small cell providers have this whole new system set just up for them, people are going to start to want those same terms, and it's going to be a race to the bottom. It's going to be very hard when you renegotiate those agreements. But for agreements that do include small cell deployments, this would preempt those. One that I'm thinking of in particular that was a specific topic of discussion was an agreement that the city of San Jose recently reached with a number of providers to contribute to a digital equity fund to incentivize development in low-income communities, and also included some in-kind contributions of smart city equipment. So that none of these agreements are grandfathered in under the bill, and even if they were, they would no longer live past the terms of that current agreement. And I think that was intentional because shortly, I think the day before this bill was introduced, a number of the providers involved in that San Jose agreement publicly made statements backing away from it. So I think the providers see this as an opportunity. I'm sorry, I forgot what the second part of your question was.
Well, I have two, because now I'm racing on all these other questions that just keep popping in my head.
It's a deep rabbit hole.
You know, let me ask just the bottom line for me, very selfishly, I might add, is that we're engaged in actually building fiber optics across our region. So it's not wireless, it's not small cell deployment, but it's actual fiber to our communities. Is this bill going to affect us in any way?
So not directly. The bill does not deal with fiber deployments or any sort of wireline deployment. But like I said, our big concern is that this is going to hurt those folks that are negotiating with like cable franchises, things like that. In your case, with it sounds like a public build out, I think it's less immediately relevant. But, you know, we're kind of looking at the bigger trend and this shift away from wireline investment into handouts for wireless companies, and wondering where the bottom of that is going to be, especially because it takes a lot of wires to run a wireless network.
No doubt, no doubt. But I think it's important that we all stay vigilant on that, because certainly we're making an investment in that. And if by the stroke of a pen, it nullifies that investment, or causes the industry to move away from that, you know, we just want to be wise with what we're doing. But at the same time, we still have rural areas that are suffering. I mean, I have school districts that run on 9 megs. I don't know how they do it, but they're doing it. And whatever we can do to strengthen broadband in our rural areas, we have to pursue. That's just the language of modern business. Yeah. You've got to have it if you're going to have an economy. So anyway, I do appreciate, I'll get off the phone, but I do appreciate you guys having these moments of conversation.
Yeah, well, and that's a really good point that we've brought up with our conversations on the Hill and in the FCC, is that small cell technology is really exciting, and 5G has a lot of potential and can do a lot in dense urban areas. But in rural areas, in smaller communities, in low-income places, it's just going to leave them further and further behind if we don't seriously invest in fiber in those places.
Yeah, because the small cell still has to have backhaul to somewhere else.
Yeah, it's
and if you do everything microwave, you're only going to get so much limited capacity out of that, and then you got to contend with environmental effects over long hauls. So we're not going to get away with from fiber in our rural areas, I don't believe.
No, and you touched on something I didn't even mention, but I'll add to it. You mentioned the environmental effects, and one of the things that we've raised over and over is that the FCC started proceedings to update its RF emission safety standards in 2013 and has not finished it. And it's ridiculous that they want to expedite the deployment of all of this equipment that doesn't even have a transmission standard developed yet, but we have no idea what the health and safety impacts of it are. Like, at minimum, they should be providing that information so that local officials can provide that to their residents when people want to know what the heck is going up in their front yard.
Yep. 10-4, I agree. Keep up the good work.
Preaching to the choir here.
Thanks, Michael.
All righty.
All right, so I see a hand raised up with Miriam from Southwest Colorado Council of Governments. Okay. It says that attendee cannot be unmuted until they enter your PIN. I sent it to you, Miriam. Hopefully you got that and you can join us on audio. But if that doesn't work, feel free to type your question too. I'm happy to do that. And she did mention too, this may be what she was asking, but she said that she's more than willing to be a resource to those who are thinking about maybe sending a letter to their federal delegation on the STREAMLINE Act. As I mentioned earlier, she's the one that is the template in the handout section. So as you're looking through that, if you have any questions for her, maybe the approach she took or why she picked out the particular sections that she did, feel free to contact her. I'm happy to make that connection as well. Just let me know. Okay, I think we have another. Okay, that was it. So we're good. All right, and with that, just leaving it open for any last questions. We'd be happy to have them. But until then, I'll go ahead and just move on to the last part of the section, and it's to talk about what we're going to talk about next week. So next week, we will be talking about the congressional fall schedule. As you can imagine, with midterm elections coming up, it's going to get very busy very quickly. There's a lot of September 30th deadlines that they'll be looking at, particularly for fiscal year 2019. So Neil and I will be talking about what the rest of the next few months look like, and into probably December before the new legislative session starts, the 1/16th. So with that, let me check. I think we might have another question. Okay, so the handouts are in the right-hand side panel of your screen where the GoToWebinar information is near the question box. But I'll follow up with an email since I wanted to send out the information on the BDAC working group application with the disaster preparedness and recovery anyway. So I'll be sure to attach all these documents again just so you have them. Would be glad to do so. Oh, good, you found them. Perfect. Okay. I'll do it anyway, just for everybody and for those who registered but then weren't able to attend today. So. All right, with that, is there any last things you'd like to say?
No, just thank you all for your efforts on this. And like I mentioned, Maci and I work in the same building, so if you ever need something from me, I am here to help you, here to help your members. Just reach out.
Definitely, yeah. And if there's any particular telecommunications issues that you're interested in or want to learn more about, because I know there's a big learning curve even for me as I'm going through this process of learning, what the FCC is up to and what Congress is doing. I learned a whole lot about 5G the other day and still wrapping my head around it. So it may be a complicated issue to learn about, and more importantly, to tell your members about, being the cities and county governments, especially if they don't have the capacity to handle these issues themselves, because a lot of them are really small, especially in our rural areas. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to pass along resources, information, anything you need. like Angelina said, you know, we're great to be neighbors now, and that includes National Association of Counties as well. Jake is a great friend of ours, and happy to work with him when he's in the office. He does travel a lot. But with that, I don't see any more questions. So I will probably let you guys go. But speaking to the legislative briefing session next week, registration will go out early, probably on Monday, so to our membership. So feel free to reach out. Be on the lookout for that and reach out to me if you would like to get that email directly if you didn't for whatever reason. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to Angelina again for being a great speaker today, and I hope you all have a great rest of the week.